American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 16, Core Democratic Principles and Public Policy. In this segment, we'll be defining the component parts of each policymaking stage, continuing on with that, and continuing on with understanding policymaker and shaper influence at each of the stages. But we'll also be considering how public policy reflects core democratic values. So the next stage that we'll be looking at is that of policy implementation. And this is the third stage, and we've already gone through the legislative branch, and now we're moving into the executive branch. Now, with policy implementation, it can be a very difficult sort of process. And this is due to the fact that translating legislative intent into purposive action is often fraught with multiple problems. First of all, laws oftentimes have vague goals. They're built that way in order to deal with multiple changes and to allow for those who work at the street level to be able to implement them more effectively. At the same time, these laws might have multiple and oftentimes contradictory goals. And finally, there might be inadequate resources to carry out these goals. So certainly, this is something that at the legislative level, coming to the executive level for the implementation, that there are problems. Now, the important thing to consider here is that bureaucrats are the most important actors in this stage. Now, most of the time we consider bureaucrats as someone who works for the federal or state government, but one of the things to consider is that anyone who works for the government is a bureaucrat. And for example, I've got here a picture of a friend of mine who at this time was private in the U.S. Army, and now he's a first lieutenant, Isaiah Washington. He's a bureaucrat. He does a job, a very specific job, a very important job for we the people in the United States, but nonetheless, he is a bureaucrat. Now, one of the things to consider is that a lot of the problems that comes about with the implementation of policies is federalism. And because of federalism, we oftentimes have multiple levels of government. Now, not only does this make action less likely because there are multiple stages at which you have to receive the okay to move forward, it also makes accountability difficult. So you just don't know which one of the stages is responsible for the failure of a public policy. So when we look at policy implementation, there are multiple different opportunities for it to go wrong and for multiple different people to be blamed rightly or wrongly. Now, this leads to incrementalism, and we've talked about this previously. Now, incrementalism is the idea that you just make small, minor adjustments, and this is what we're seeing with federal government spending. It's not really that much in terms of major spending changes, and we can see in different policy areas that there's greater incrementalism than others where there might be greater change in other areas. And an example of this is looking at some of the work by Jones and Baumgartner, which I look at the idea of punctuated equilibria in budgeting changes. And what we see if we look at this annual percent change in dollars, we see that it's mostly at the 0% to around 20%. And when we do see change, it tends to be loaded towards the very ends where there are major changes within policy areas in budgetary spending. So that's certainly something to consider, is that oftentimes Congress does little to nothing to change, but when they do something, it can be very extreme budgetarily. Now, when we evaluate policy, which is the fourth and final stage, we have to consider multiple different things. The first thing we have to do is we have to understand that it is the process of examining the consequences of public policy. And so there are multiple different groups that are interested in what comes out. First of all, you have interest groups, and they want to know if the policy is serving the needs of its members, and this certainly makes sense. Now, the media is interested because there might be news, especially if the policy is wasting tax dollars. They're looking for stories that will get eyes and advertisement onto their platform. And finally, the minority party, the party that is out of power, will use these evaluations to hold the majority party accountable. In other words, it provides them grist for the mill in the political give and take so that they can re-attain power. So the thing to consider, though, is that public policy often deals with difficult, even intractable problems. So they're dealing with issues that have multiple different things that are dealt with, such as economic, environmental, and social goods. And these goods can be in conflict with one another. And certainly we've seen the economic goods being in conflict with environmental and social goods. At the same time, public policy deals with issues that have complex causes. We don't necessarily know what causes a problem, which is why government is involved. And on top of it, there are multiple bottom lines. For instance, equity and equality, the whole idea that we need to be fair, oftentimes finds itself pitted against efficiency. In this sense, business is easy because there is only one bottom line. It's profit. Whereas with government, there are multiple bottom lines that must be dealt with. So when we evaluate policy, there are typically two approaches. The first is looking at the process evaluation, and this is assessing whether a policy is being implemented according to its stated guidelines. So you're looking at outputs, what is going through the process here. And this is something that pretty much all government programs have, and it's a very effective way of seeing how a program is working. But ultimately, the question is what is its impact? So what are the outcomes of the policy? And this is a big question, because to assess the overall objectives and whether they've been met with different policies can oftentimes be difficult based upon the idea that there are multiple different bottom lines, and causality can oftentimes be very complex. And untangling what causes what can be fraught with great difficulties. Now finally, we have to consider those core democratic values and public policy. Ultimately, the three concepts that are the core of democracy, majority rule, political freedom, and political equality, need to be addressed by the public policies that come out of government. Now, it's not necessarily the case at all times, or even the majority of the times, but a government that serves its public effectively is one that has oversight by the public. And this is what majority rule provides. So it's either the 50% plus one, or a plurality is preferred by eligible citizens. And so if government generally does a good job of addressing the policy preferences of its citizens, it's working. And here in the United States, we can say that that is the case. However, political scientists have found that money and the influence that it brings can lead to greater government responsiveness to these individuals' desires and needs. And that is one of the challenges, is that a small minority that possess great amounts of wealth can overcome the power of majority rule. Now, political freedom, the ability to express wants and demands, is the most easily recognized of all American values. And Americans have a high degree of it, certainly with the internet, with the ability to communicate by letters to the editor, communicate with representatives. It's in good shape. However, this relies upon a transparent government. In other words, we need to see what government is doing and how it is doing it. A secretive government is one that cannot have oversight over, and freedom is taken away from the public as a result. At the same time, the ability to be heard is incredibly important. If you have freedom, does it matter if you cannot exercise it? Now, lastly, political equality, which is individual preferences are given equal weight, is something that has a great deal of difficulties with it. And in our earlier lectures, we dealt with the multiple different types of equality out there. And we know that in this country, large groups have found difficulties with attaining it. And certainly we can look at African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, women, homosexuals, so on and so forth, have had difficulty with attaining political equality. Yet things are getting better. Now, at the same time, and this goes along with the idea that majority rule matters, is economic inequality has proven to be a challenge in the past, has led to great instability in this country. So the economic inequality, who influences who has their preferences weighed more? And certainly this is one of those major issues that policymakers need to address in the future. Now, ultimately, understanding American government means understanding that the people of the country matter, as does the structure. What the structure does, it allows for rules of the game that all people understand and all people play fairly under. And this is what most political scientists believe, that the game is more important than the players. And winning and losing, that's a part of the game, but ultimately it's about the game itself. It's about having a political system that serves all people and keeps conflict from becoming violent, and keeps conflict in a process that politically is easily dealt with. So ultimately, in conclusion, I'll just state one more time, we the people matter, but the structure of government that our founding fathers put together and that we have tweaked over the years matters because it supports we the people in the process of our core democratic values of political equality, of freedom, and of majority rule. American national government.